I'm Thanasi Kambanis. You're listening to Order from Ashes. As our listeners know, the American led world order has collapsed in recent times. The international liberal order that held sway since World War II is in shambles, suddenly and conclusively swept away by the radical and destabilizing actions of Donald Trump. And that has left the world wondering what's going on. Or at least that's one version of the story that people have been telling about the so-called international liberal order. Today, I'm joined by Nick Danforth, who's deputy editor of Foreign Policy magazine, also a fellow at Century International, and the author of a recent essay that somewhat snarkily asks whether, if the international liberal order is dead, who killed it and where's the corpse? Nick, thanks for coming on Order from Ashes.
Delighted to come on. Great to be here.
So here we are. It's the second week where the US is preparing maybe to attack Iran again, where there are war zones in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, all and Africa, sorry, all of which the US and its allies are involved in, and in which whatever sense of predictability we knew 10 or 20 years ago has really evaporated. Why don't you start by telling us what your answer to the first question is, whether the international liberal order is dead?
Can I start by asking you a question?
Well, it's a podcast, I guess so.
No, I hadn't thought about it until you were saying the name of the show. It's a very optimistic, in Order from Ashes, just given what we're talking about today. It's a really, it's a genuinely positive trajectory that you're anticipating in the name of the show. Is this a name you came up with at a moment where we were all much more optimistic about this whole issue?
I mean, I came up with the name partly because uh, it speaks to chaos, right? You don't get to ashes without a lot of destruction. And the way I think of it, I mean, I do try to be optimistic because otherwise, what's the point? But is we're trying to make sense of things that seem chaotic. So it's not really order from ashes in the sense that we're going to build something out of rubble in a broken world. It's more that we are going to bring some order to our understanding of something that seems beyond understanding and beyond comprehension. And by the way, I came up with this name in the late 2010s when things during an earlier Trump administration, when things seemed fragile but not dead.
So it's really intellectual order from ashes.
Yeah, and I mean the
We're making
project,
sense of
the
that.
project as a progressive policy analyst is to change real world outcomes, right? So at the end of this rainbow, if we can think of it as a rainbow, we want an order that's tangible, like a governance order in places like the US and a world order that actually is predictable and just and fair and nurturing for people.
And that's why I'm glad we're prefacing it with all of this, because that is the point I'd be eager to mention before we dive into all the pessimism and the story of how we went from possibly order to what's definitely ashes. Is yeah, the purpose of this debate is at some point, I certainly think, I know you and I agree on this, to figure out how you end up rebuilding something. I mean, if we've gone from order to ashes, the goal is to get back to order somehow, not just intellectually, but like actually in the world. So,
And you clearly question, and this is part of why I'm really interested in talking to you about this. You clearly question how much of an order there was to begin with, right? So there's a uh, not just tongue in cheek, but a serious critique of when people bemoan the death of the international liberal order, they're often
yes.
bemoaning the death of something that was good for them individually, but that wasn't actually really a good, just scaffolding for the whole world.
And that's what I realized something even more pessimistic as I was writing the article that we're talking about here, which is that the whole conversation about the death of the intellectual international order, as I recall, started a little over a decade ago around the time Trump was first elected. And at that time, people very much talked about Trump and the threat he posed to this thing, the liberal international order, as if it was a firm, clear, established, well-grounded thing that had international scope that had existed since the end of World War II and that made life better for everyone. Uh, And it's ironic that no one had necessarily talked about it in those terms since the end of World War II. This was really was a coinage, an idea that was developed in retrospect as we saw whatever we were nostalgic for, as we saw whatever we thought we'd had clearly crumbling. People first attached a name to it. I mean, even the phrase was not in wide use. I mean, now it's people joke about it as one of those cliches of DC policy discussions, but it really wasn't something people were talking about through the Cold War or even after the Cold War. Uh, but suddenly, as we saw that Trump was clearly doing something bad and was destroying something very important, there's this retroactive, very idealistic use of the idea of the liberal international order. And what I always, a decade ago, writing about this, what I always tried to emphasize, and what I hope still comes through in this article, is that so much of what we were talking about was aspirational. It was something that US policymakers very much had tried to achieve after World War II. They did have this vision of a much more rules-based, much more democratic order, a vision in which things like the United Nations would be real, powerful international institutions that would bring peace, where things like the UN Convention on Human Rights, the Genocide Convention would be somehow enforced, would operate, would be real. This was very much the aspiration. Then the Cold War started, and rather than have some kind of actually existing liberal international order, we had the Cold War order. We had a bipolar order in which the United States and Russia were competing about a lot of things, in which Russia's perfidy, the need to destroy the communist forces in the world to eventually bring peace and democracy, ended up being the excuse that the United States used for doing a lot of really undemocratic, really
We had to
non-peaceful
destroy the
stuff.
world in order to save it, huh?
That's that's exactly what it was. And so when people talk about Trump and the danger he posed, what I always tried to emphasize a decade ago is that the danger was very real, but it wasn't that he was destroying an actually existing order. He was destroying the aspiration for the order. What you had for the past 75 years was a kind of liberal internationalist consensus in US foreign policy. You had US policymakers on both parties in different degrees and different ways shot through with hypocrisy, but still broadly agree that we did want a more rules-based, more democratic, and conveniently US-led order in the world.
So this is what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this podcast, and I just want to set the terms of the reason why I care about this question, right? I don't I am interested in intellectual history and idea debates, but in this case, I'm interested in behavior, state behavior, superpower behavior, questions of adjudication of war and peace, international trade, the really key things that make our world more or less livable. So that's why I'm interested in this liberal international order, only insofar as it affected real world outcomes, real behaviors. So I guess that's maybe a good starting point for assessing the thing before we assess whether it died and who killed it. How much of this post Cold War web of practices and institutions and laws actually constrained short term self interest in favor of some kind of shared common good?
It's all relative. And this maybe that's a cop-out answer, but it's a cop-out answer I'm going to stick to here. And I think this is why so many people had so much difficulty figuring out what to make of Trump and why so many of our colleagues further on the left, I think unfortunately were a little too naively optimistic about the positive change that Trump could bring.
Well, the
I feel,
accelerationists are always a little over optimistic about the benefits of nihilism.
yeah, and we're unfortunately seeing that play out now. Uh, it always seemed to me, and I suspect you're in the same boat. I mean, the United States gave a lot of public credit to this idea of liberal internationalism, to this idea of playing by the rules, to this idea of promoting democracy. Clearly, that was not what the United States did for most of the Cold War. Uh, but that was the aspiration of liberal internationalism. Many of us thought that the goal would be to have the United States actually live up to those stated values. To have the United States actually support democracy, have the United States stop working with dictatorships, have the United States stop launching wars in violation of international law. That seemed like we all agreed there was some deep hypocrisy here. Many of us thought we should reconcile the hypocrisy by stopping doing bad things. Unfortunately, the way things went was the complete opposite way. We just gave up on the pretense of the values. We gave up on any aspiration to actually do the right thing, to actually even pretend to care about liberal democratic values. And I think what Trump is showing is however imperfect the old system was, the new one looks dramatically worse.
Well, so this is, I mean, this is a real core uh, curiosity for me. I actually started a book that I have yet to finish because largely because I was flummoxed by this question, right? So the starting argument of the book was the U.S. invasion of Iraq conclusively broke what were like this existing, somewhat flawed but genuinely meaningful web of restraint and norms and values that was good, something that made the world trend towards better outcomes. The US invaded Iraq in this illegal, blatantly dishonest way, killed a ton of people, also broke the norms of reciprocity that had, it turns out in retrospect actually restrained bad behavior by states, including the US. And so we ended up in this free fall that brought us to Trumpism. Now, as I was putting meat on that argument, what I kept stumbling up against was a lot of compelling historical evidence that it was always this bad, that this order, or at least it could have been worse, and we saw it get worse afterwards. Well, then once you start looking from the vantage point of Angola or Honduras or Vietnam or any an endless parade of Cold War and post Cold War uh, uh, places that were on the losing end of this supposed order, which turns out largely to be a sort of uh, cartel of privileged states that get benefits from some kind of pact, but it's not actually an order. I I really hit a wall with this because I mean I somewhere in my gut, like emotionally, I want to believe that we really were trending towards something better. Now
Yeah.
that we're trending towards something worse, that's reversible. But these questions about what is that order make it really hard to really put some precision on what that supposed shared good is.
First of all, I'm impressed that when you got stumped on the main organizing question in your book, you actually paused to think about it instead of just, finishing the book anyway, which I think is what a lot of people do. It's a tribute to
Thanks for
actual
making
intellectual.
a virtue out of my defeat.
Um, no, I mean, look, I'd say only somewhat cynically, like the liberal international order everyone talks about, like it kind of lasted from 1998 to 2003. Like it really wasn't to the extent there was some like trajectory. It was like, all right, right off the whole Cold War, like the whole Cold War, like everyone was like, yeah, we eventually want to spread this model of liberal democracy from Western Europe and NATO across the entire globe. But like, we've got a Cold War on, we got to beat the Russians. Beating the Russians will enable us to do that. Then democracy, everything will triumph. Cold War ended, and then there's this optimism like, okay, now finally, I mean, they literally talked about the New World Order after the Cold War. There was the sense of like, okay, all those ideas that we had in the immediate aftermath of World War II, we can actually realize now. And this was this insane burst of 1990s end of history optimism that still, like, then in 1993 you had the Rwandan genocide, and people were like, oh well, we said never again, and we couldn't actually act on that during the Cold War because Russia was around. And even after the Cold War, it turns out we still didn't really care enough to prevent genocide. And then there was genocide going on in the Balkans, and there was as a huge debate about whether or not we should intervene. Belatedly, the United States did intervene. And then when the same thing started happening in Kosovo, there was actually this political momentum to be like, we're going to really do something. We're going to stop genocide in Kosovo. Um, that, ironically, as I mentioned in the article, also became the first moment when even before Iraq, people were like, the rules have already gone out the window.
So
Like
you're so
far.
not, when you say 1998 was the beginning of this tiny honeymoon for an international liberal order, you're dating that to the Kosovo intervention.
Right. The example of like Milosevic was doing something bad. We saw him doing something bad. We were like, we are going to intervene to stop this very directly.
So I remember that time as being a time with some amount of optimism. I mean the
Yeah.
idea was that after the end of the Cold War, it was actually possible to do something like stop a genocide. So when the genocide happened in Rwanda and the West failed, it was awful. And it was the first time that it had been possible, right? Previously, they wouldn't have been able
Yeah,
to
that's a good
intervene
way to
because
put
it
it.
would have been like a Soviet US sphere of influence thing. So this was the first time it was on the table. And so there was a caucus of people, myself as a college student among them, who perhaps naively, right? Because in retrospect, I'm not sure sending the U.S. Marines around the world to stop genocide is going to work either. But at the time, I was in this segment of society that thought now we can have a UN backed missions that go around the world
Exactly.
stopping genocide. And by the time Kosovo came around, I was happy that there was this intervention, and I was really happy when Milosevic got arrested and sent to The Hague. That felt to me, I mean, in retrospect, again, it was the sort of the last time anything serious like this was attempted. At the time, it felt like, wow, we're entering an era where like an
Yeah.
American head of state could go to The Hague after serving as president because justice will trump parochial national interests.
Right, and as you say, like, right, there was an international tribunal that was going to judge Milosevic, who'd been thrown out of power by a democratic uprising in his own country after we bombed his country. It was like this fantasy of how all this was supposed to work, which then unfortunately went to people's heads. And that, it seems to me, is how you have the Iraq War and how you have a lot of, I think, well-meaning, sincere liberals who backed the Iraq War because they really did accept the premise that this was going to spread democracy, this was going to spread liberal values, this was going to be the crusading side of liberal internationalism, and that that's not what Dick Cheney believed. That's not why Dick Cheney was doing it. But for a lot of people in even Democrats who supported the war, that it was easy to get caught up in that kind of optimistic belief. And I mean, God knows people should continue to be critical of the Iraq War. God knows it was a disaster. God knows it should have been clear it was going to be a disaster, even at the time. But understanding where it came from, understanding where that optimism, what that optimism was driven by. And also, I mean, it's worth pointing out, given how bad things have gotten with Trump, I mean, there was a universalism to the idea of democratizing Iraq. I mean, it wasn't uh, Muslims are evil. It wasn't Arabs can't be democratic. It was like, oh, democracy is so powerful that all we have to do is go in and smash this dictator. And like, maybe we won't talk about the fact it was a dictator we were also supporting. But even that, I think deep down, a lot of the Bush people acknowledged. They were like, yeah, like during the Cold War, we had to support this awful dictator. And now the Cold War is over and we can just go smash him and everything's going to be great. Uh, and, yeah, to the extent that was a terrible idea and that destroyed Iraq, destroyed U.S. foreign policy, destroyed the credibility of our elite, also destroyed this optimism that we really were on the path to anything better.
I'm Thanasi Kambanis. You are listening to Order from Ashes, podcast from Century International. I'm talking to Nick Danforth, deputy editor of Foreign Policy magazine and also a fellow here at Century International. We're prompted by the publication of a recent essay of his in Foreign Policy called "Who Killed the Liberal International Order? A contested idea. A contested idea has seen many alleged deaths." So, Nick, I want to turn a little bit to the question of the U.S. role in this, right? Because ultimately although the U.S. is not the center of the world, it's one of the sort of central objects of our attention and work. And in this, right before the break, we were talking about sort of the period of from late Clinton to early Bush and the invasion of Iraq. So now I tend to see as a marker the post 9/11 era, right? Like the 9/11 happens, the US shifts to this war on terror footing. And I mean, it's maybe lost on younger folks who weren't around for this. But for me, one of the big dividing points was before 9/11, most Americans thought the rest of the world didn't matter and they just didn't want to think about it very much. So maybe elites were concerned with foreign affairs or the fall of the Soviet Union or whatever, or the genocide in Rwanda or Kosovo. But in terms of politics, these were not important issues. After 9/11, for a time, everyone wanted to talk in usually unhelpful ways about the rest of the world and how America could, control, limit, bomb, whatever, do things to it in order to make America safer. And that ushered in this 2.5 decade period that has sort of consumed my adult life and I think yours. Uh, you trace some key points here and some interestingly bipartisan blame for killing this web of things that I think you're saying is good. Like it might be overstated how important it
Yes.
is, but it's like
Yes.
it's a desirable set of practices and norms and behaviors. And a lot like it's Julius Caesar in the Roman Senate. Like everyone takes their turn with the dagger. So tell us a little bit about the different uh, sort of accretion of wounds to this order.
Well, what I tried to trace in the article was really two approaches to how America has abandoned the liberal international order, which is to the extent there's a bipartisan consensus, everyone agrees that when there's bad stuff happening in the world, that's proof that the liberal international order is dying. But the partisan split really is that consistently, those of us on the left have said that it's American overreach, it's America's own violation of the rules that's the really deadly blow to the liberal international order. So on the far left, this is people pointing to Kosovo as an example where the United States did violate the idea that you can't change international borders by force by recognizing Kosovo. It's a precedent that Putin used when he annexed Crimea. I don't think it's at all similar. I don't think what the United States did in Kosovo justifies the annexation of Crimea, but in a very, very legalistic sense, you can certainly see, like, yeah, that the United States broke one of the rules that we're now telling people to uphold. Likewise, is for the reasons that we both just discussed, the Iraq War has always been the classic example for those of us who don't think the United States should launch dumb wars in violation of international law. Like Iraq was something we should not have done. Uh, Although, I mean, again, given the state we are now, even the fact that the Bush administration cared enough to lie to the United Nations about the weapons of mass destruction, that almost seems like a throwback to a more honest era. Now there'd be no pretense.
Well, or a less honest and better era. I mean, I'm not sure honest,
Exactly.
right? I mean, I mean, sorry, I don't want to derail your train of thought, but
No,
I think
fair,
one of the
fair.
takeaways from Mark Carney's speech and from the subtext of this conversation is that aspirations towards some kind of comity and norms actually create real world restraints on bad action. And like hypocrisy
Yes.
turns out to be better than honesty when it comes to being a crappy, violent, militaristic power.
Right. And if nothing else, that idea that you needed some kind of international consensus, that you couldn't start too many wars, I mean, it stopped the Bush administration from invading Iran, which, the heyday of the Iraq War, people thought was going to be next, and which, we still might do now. Uh, but yeah, so just to say, like from the left, it was always US overreach. It was, Kosovo on the far left, Iraq, pretty much everyone thought, US failure to stop genocide in Gaza. That was clearly something where the hypocrisy became much more front and center. Uh, and yet, this was going alongside the right-wing version of this, which was always that the United States failed to uphold the liberal international order by not doing enough. You and I remember the debates over Syria lasted for the better part of a decade, where people, understandably horrified by what was happening, by what the Assad regime was doing, were calling for United States intervention and were making the argument that if the United States didn't intervene, it would lead to the unraveling of the liberal international order. It would lead to empowering Russia. Um, this was a moment where I was certainly cynical only about that framing. I mean, there have been so many situations in the world where the United States had done nothing in the face of this kind of atrocity. I mean, even in Syria under Bashar al-Assad's father, there was no, again, in the Cold War era, there was no pretense we would ever do anything to stop atrocities like this. But this was a point that a lot of people brought up. Then when Russia invaded Ukraine, the first time in 2014 and 2016, this was cited as an example. Like, look, this is what happened because the United States didn't do more in Syria. This is setting a precedent for further Russian aggression by not responding more forcefully now. We're letting Russia tear apart the liberal international order. Um, and it wasn't like the stuff that was happening wasn't bad. It wasn't like this didn't represent
I mean,
really dangerous, destabilizing disorder. It was just a question of, was there really some hypothetical world in the past or possible at that moment in which the United States could have stopped all of this?
yeah, and I mean, I think as we go on, I want us to try and interrogate whether there are better ways to express like the serious ideas that are implicit in this weirdly like dead term international liberal order. But so going to this example you're mentioning of the Obama period. So first we have 8 years of George W. Bush, and the first half of that is like making war all over the world. The second half of that is a sort of chastening. Cheney gets sidelined, and there's this idea that America has overreached, but not by that much, right? A little bit of a sense of overreach, and there is. I mean, you nodded to this, and I want to focus on it a little bit because I think it's really important. It turns out, in retrospect, like George W. Bush was far less racist and Islamophobic than certainly than the Trump administrations, right? So this guy who was breaking large parts of the world and responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, mostly Muslims in the Islamic world, was paradoxically at least a person who viewed Muslims as equally human to Christians in this sort of born again Christian framework he
Yes.
had, and equally worthy of his brand of democracy, which at the
Yeah.
time felt like a racist colonial set of ideas. But then when I compare it to what we see today, which is blatant disregard for entire societies and people's lives, I'm astonished by what was there and was lost. Uh, and so all that is to set the table for what happened when Obama came in and seemed to be skirting in this very intellectual way a debate between when to intervene and when to not intervene. And I'm very dissatisfied by the way we describe these debates because I don't think it captures what's it's like. What are the two poles here? Is it international liberal order and like great power competition, or is it uh, America pursuing values sometimes versus America pursuing primarily or exclusively like short-term financial gain? I mean, I don't. I realize this is a messy spaghetti-like question, but I think you understand what I'm trying to more clearly identify than I'm able to right now.
Well, let me take the debate back to the 90s for a minute, because I do think this gets to some of it, and it's something that gets lost in a lot of our post-Iraq debates. Is that right? The idea that, the whole kind of Samantha Power idea that you'd actually have the United States use military force in a purely idealistic way, that was seen as such a leftist idealistic view back in the day that was rejected by wide swaths of the American people. And that now the default criticism of Washington or the blob, whatever you want to call it, is this assumption that Washington is reflexively hawkish and that the United States always wants to bomb something, always wants to intervene. And going back to the 90s, what was so striking is the assumption was that the United States government never wanted to get involved in anything. There was this profound fear of putting boots on the ground. It was why they were so slow to go into Bosnia. And this is the subtext for books like A Problem from Hell. It's the subtext for 90s movies like Air Force One, which I do
I
think
mean,
is kind of
Black
like
Hawk Down, another movie, is like the generator of this fear, right? I forget how
right. You
many
actually had an
people.
intervention where a lot of Americans were killed trying to keep Somalis from starving. And the response to that was, well, what were they doing there in the first place? Why were we risking Americans for some kind of humanitarian venture? There's all this, we don't want America to be the world policeman. George Bush spoke out against nation building during the course of his presidential debate with Al Gore. And yeah, this was very much the framing that it was the lack of, it was the lack of the United States American courage, American resolve that was preventing us from solving all of these problems. Um, and in retrospect, that seemed wildly naive, but it was, I think what changed with 9/11 is all of a sudden you did have other reasons for America to intervene, and that post 9/11 fear of terrorism, all the weapons of mass destruction stuff. I mean, it's also like they didn't sell the Iraq war as we have to bring democracy to Iraq. Like, I mean, they tried to sell it that way, but that was not the main reason they got Americans to support it. They supported it because terrorism was bad and we were scared of what the Middle East was up to, and we were worried that Saddam Hussein was going to have weapons of mass destruction. And that was the actual logic that got us involved in the war. And that was the logic that was necessary because people don't want, there was this deep opposition to risking American lives for something that didn't seem immediately necessary.
Of
And if I could just finish my rant, because this is
course.
is building up to something that I somehow I don't no one ever talks about. I tried to talk about it in this article. You know, everyone, when Obama didn't intervene in Syria, part of the reason he didn't intervene is because he knew there wasn't a huge amount of popular support for it. He did actually go to Congress, saying that if he got congressional support, he would intervene after the weapons of mass destruction red line. Congress did not jump at the opportunity to support him. Much less that was just intervening in Syria. When it came to intervening in Russia, intervening in Ukraine against Russia when they seized Crimea, there was no public appetite for that. And yet this narrative that like, oh, if only we'd stood up, to Russia then, if only we'd showed more resolve, if only we'd showed more courage, this became such a talking point
I
for the
believe that.
credibility crowd.
I totally believe that.
Wait, do you? All right,
Yeah.
this will be fun. All right, let me bringing this to the starting point, the part that really annoys me, and this is why I'm getting so animated, the narrative was always like, oh, if only Obama had done something in Syria to stop Russia there. Syria, when Putin saw he could get away with the Syria intervention, when he saw he could get away with Crimea in 2014, it set the precedent for everything else bad that happened in Ukraine. Everyone forgets the first time Vladimir Putin launched a totally unprovoked war of aggression at a neighboring state over an international border was Georgia in 2008. George Bush was president then. George Bush didn't do shit about it. And if there was any precedent for everything else that happened, that was it. No one talks about it though, because in our political debate, George Bush is coded as the cowboy, Obama is coded as the effete liberal. And so the idea that like, yeah, actually Russia was much weaker in 2008. George Bush was a Republican. He presumably could have gotten all these, Cold Warriors on board with whatever he wanted to do. That, if there's any precedent, if there was any moment where we failed to draw the line in the sand, that was it. Again, no one talks about it because it doesn't fit into this highly politicized debate about whether or not the problem is America doing too much or doing too little.
So I think we agree more than you might you might want to think. So uh I think
Thank you for letting me go on that
yeah, no,
spiel. I
that was
appreciate
great.
it.
That's the joy of a podcast. So I think that the death of like a culture of universalism began really in full force with the invasion of Iraq, and I think that we shouldn't confuse all military interventions. Like all military interventions are not the same, and so yes, the U.S. is like all too willing, at least post 9/11, to use military intervention. But in fact, sometimes a military intervention is good. A military intervention to stop a genocide in Rwanda would have been a good thing, right? If
Yeah.
it had saved some of the 600,000 people who were murdered in 100 days. So we're not. I'm not against. I'm not a pacifist. I'm for mostly avoiding the use of force and certainly avoiding the reflexive and ill-conceived use of force. But the the erosion that had long been underway and fueled by hypocrisy, I think it really accelerated with the invasion of Iraq. And then my take, and this is what I had been trying to sort of put together in this book, is that slowly other actors around the world started being bolder about ventures
Right.
that they had been interested in. I mean, it's not that like Vladimir Putin was going to be Olaf Palme, and then after we invaded Iraq, he was like, oh, maybe I'll become like a territorial power mad despot. Like that's what he always wanted. But seeing the aftermath of the Iraq War, and it's really two things because we haven't talked about incompetence, which is the other major through line here, right? So it's on the one hand, a complete disregard for the law and for reason, right? Like what's going to happen here, we don't care. Like the point is to show our might. And secondly, it was incompetently executed. So not only was it a terrible idea, we killed a bunch of Iraqis on false pretenses and we did it, largely actually to show the world, and this is what I disagreed with your interpretation about earlier. I think the main motivating impulse was actually very specifically to show the world that America was a huge power that didn't have to follow the rules. We knew this was against the rules, and we wanted to smash something in a way that defied expectations and norms, so that people would say, "Oh my God, these people are crazy. You cannot mess with them." And so once we did that, we also did it in this rinky dink, like clown car way. So, like, it was bungled. So venal, murderous, terrible, strategically a disaster. Also, like, done amateur hour. And that combination made powers like China, powers like Russia, and in smaller regional contexts, manifold other regional powers say like, oh, I can grab, I can, for
Uh,
Russia, first they can, take these small sub republics, then they can invade Georgia in the summer of 2008, which I remember because that my first child was weaned when when my wife had to go and cover that war. We were in Moscow at the time, and so I had to switch her to formula.
that's more, I just remember watching it on TV. I have no. Um, but no, that I totally agree with everything you're saying about the Iraq War, the incompetence that was involved in it. I mean, I definitely also the fact that they wanted to smash something. I mean, there's a famous Thomas Friedman quote about just needing to punch someone to show we were back. I think that's, you know, after 9/11, there was this desire for just a sheer show of power. I don't, maybe I'm not quite as cynical to think they consciously wanted to do it in violation of international law, but they definitely wanted to do it. And when you really want to smash something, it's harder to do it in in the confines of international law anyways. But right, to the extent that was much more the real motivation than bringing democracy, or at least for most of the people involved, certainly contributed to why it was such a disaster, certainly contributed to why it in turn gave the impression that America was not as strong, not as competent, not as well run, not as militarily dominant as we wanted to think. The only uh, uh,
Go ahead, because then I'm going to change the subject for the last part of our
okay,
conversation.
no, the only thing I'd say is that, and this is where I think the historical critiques of the idea of the liberal international order is something that just kind of existed in perfection since the end of World War II are important. The there was a trajectory to American power here. A lot of this would have happened anyways. Cold War ended with an unprecedented historical moment of unique American hegemony, that would have started to disappear anyways. That there gradually would have been more, like Russia would have had more room, Russia would have rebuilt, Russia would have had more strength to try to chip away at parts of this they didn't like. China would have gotten stronger, other international actors would have gotten stronger. Some of this would have been unsustainable. The big question to me, and I guess where this is interesting in a historical sense, and hopefully in some kind of future looking sense, is if the United States had used its power smartly, had done smart interventions instead of dumb interventions, had been more committed multilaterally, is there ever a way in which we could have constructed a world in which both the norms and the alignment of military force were such that, like you said, I mean, Putin still might have harbored whatever desires he did deep in his heart, but that he would have been constrained. He wouldn't have, he would have had Ukraine join NATO in it. Russia would have somehow looked at that and said, okay, well, like we really can't fuck around with this anymore. We really can't challenge the powers that be. We're going to somehow develop a more cooperative relationship. We're going to somehow accept the terms of the world that the United States has created because, in part, it has so much international buy-in. There's so many other countries who are on board with this that, like, we, Russia, don't have a bunch of rogue nations that will work with us in
Hmm.
trying to challenge everything. Like, there really is a concerted NATO European Union that will, like, forcefully push us back at every step. At the time, I thought that was possible. In retrospect, it's harder for me to believe.
I'm talking to Nick Danforth, deputy editor of foreign policy and a fellow here at the Century International. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and you're listening to Order from Ashes. We're talking about the purported death of the international liberal order, or as Nick calls it, the liberal international order, or as
Wait,
others
am I the
call it.
only?
Yeah, you and when Wikipedia just flip it around, but that's we don't need to get into this here, but that's I think how the original Eikenberry pieces on this in the 90s, I think called it the liberal international
Fascinating.
order.
Didn't know
Um,
that.
so I only know that because I had to read those in grad school. So uh, I want to talk about what can come next. I mean, there's like 2 hours of
Yeah,
interregnum I'd love to talk about, which is like the shared blame of like the entire American elite across parties and supposed value types. But let's put that to the side, and let's ask uh, whether we could now in the sort of shambles that we're in start to assemble something better. And maybe you can go first. I have a little sort of
sure.
dream fantasy idea about how this could go and what we could call it. But I
No,
want to
if
hear
you've
from
got an
yours
idea,
first.
you go
No,
first,
no,
please.
yours
I
is going to
don't.
be better.
No, I don't even know. I mean, it still seems like it's going to be a rearguard action for the foreseeable future. I don't. I mean, I think what's interesting, and I will say this, when Joe Biden came back into office, everyone intellectually was like, we can't just go back to the world the way it was before. Like, there's no turning back. We need to build back better, et cetera, et cetera. But like, no one knew what else to do, and the world was still familiar enough. Things hadn't changed so much that you could still instinctively fall into the idea of like, we're just going to do what we did before and try to make all the old stuff work better now. And I fear, hopefully in 2028, there'll be a Democrat back in power. The world is going to look so different that I don't know. I mean, I still have not figured out how you would go about, I think there's some basic, I think the United States should find a way to support democracy. We should find a way to cooperate with our allies as best as possible, even knowing that they're not and shouldn't necessarily trust us going forward. Um, but in terms of how that fits into a bigger vision, in terms of how much, we can see these as efforts to restructure the world rather than to just get wins for, our values and our allies where we can. I don't know. It's hard for me to see that.
Well, I mean the hopeful models I see include the, to some extent the U.S. the parts of it and its approach that have been attractive and have made it a place that people like my parents wanted to emigrate to, right? So there's a certain piece of the American approach that I think is one of the ingredients for what we want next. I think the Europeans have a really great uh, uh, model for us within limits, and then I would say the Chinese piece of this is development, right? You can't take care of your people unless you are actually making enough wealth and distributing it wide, equally enough to raise people's standard of living. But the sort of Western ideas that I'm focused more on are the sort of the best of Europe and the best of the U.S. And I think from Europe, what we get is this idea of pooled sovereignty, right? So there's a really wonderful core in the European Union of being willing to sacrifice some national interests in favor of a sort of utilitarian like equality for all. Now, the limits of that are that Europe is profoundly not democratic, right? So it is the most important decisions are made by unelected uh, elites, and there is almost no democratic feedback, including even to member governments on certain issues. So that's like that's why that model can't be. We can't say like let's take an EU and adapt it and make a world order based on the EU. So we take that piece of it, and then I think we take the American rhetoric of democracy, which I think the American vision of democracy is the best one out there, never fully implemented in practice. But that's okay. We don't have to copy the American practice. We can copy the American ideal of real checks and balances and democratic feedback that ultimately connects to citizens, right? The feedback of citizens. And that's what we build a world order based on. And for it to work, for it to be different than the old one, the superpowers have to submit to it.
Right.
So you can't have a world order like the UN's where the P5, the five most powerful nations at the time of its founding, get a carve out. So they're not subject to any of the rules. We set up an international criminal court, and all the main crime committing states did not submit to its jurisdiction. So, what is that? That's nonsensical. And by the way, it connects to the fundamental problem with American democracy, which is that our own government doesn't submit to its own laws, right? We have qualified immunity for agents of the government at all levels. And so we don't, just like abroad, the idea of an American president going on trial for war crimes is ludicrous. So too is the idea of an American cop facing a trial, a fair trial for violence against an unarmed civilian. Like these are norms that only shift in societies after periods of mass breakage. Right? Europe was willing to change its practices after more than a century. I'd say 130 years of near continuous war from
Right.
1815 to 1944. Only then, in like multiple generations of ruin, did they say, "Okay, let's have an approach where we actually compromise and share sovereignty."
But and even then, even after all that horror, it was still only the elites. I mean, to get back to what you were pointing out earlier, it was still only the elites that were really on board with that project, which is why they had to make it kind of undemocratic, because they worried that if citizens were really given a say in this, the citizens would opt for the same kind of nationalism and sovereignty concerns that had gotten you that previous century and a half of war. So I don't.
I mean, this is my idealism speaking, but I think that when we have genuine citizen input, we end up with society improving, right? We get the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the
Yes.
United States, right? We get these. I mean, okay, maybe Obama was too optimistic when he talked about the arc of history bending towards justice, but like I think it's fair enough to take a read on the 20th century and say for a long period of time, overall, more and more people got the franchise,
Yes.
more and more people got to eat, more and more people got to have babies without dying in childbirth. These all
Yes.
these different sort of measures of dignity and rights and representation, political representation, and freedom from war, right? I mean, this is all a big one that underlies our interest here. Like, why do we give a crap about the international liberal order? Because it reduces
Right.
wars that kill and displace millions of people. Like, that's why we want to have this, not because it, lowers, raises the lifespan or lowers the incidence of some disease. We like this because it it removes this very core threat to people's ability to live and live stably.
No, and in the long run, I totally agree with you. I just increasingly it feels more like it's some coming out of some deep, like quasi-religious liberal faith in humanity rather than any rational read of history. It's like, no, I mean, like the arc of history, it like zigzags wildly and hopefully in the long run ends up somewhere closer to justice.
What would you call it if you could, I mean, the name is part of the problem. If there's something that's called the rules based international liberal order, like already you've lost any listener. Like, what does that mean? I don't know. So what would you call it?
You mean something that would resonate with the American people that would be like,
And
this is
not, I
about,
mean, ideally
and
with
yeah,
with people all over the world, something that like sounds appealing and also like from the name you can tell what it is.
dude, I just can't believe you're springing this on me in the last minutes of the podcast. I,
The
I got
Freedom and
nothing.
Justice Order, the Freedom and
The
Justice League,
global
the
awesome.
Board of Peace. Just kidding. That one's already out there and is.
That's the problem. All the aesthetics, I mean, like the gold fringe, the gold laurel leaf wrapped globe, like that they've got. That is the kind of aesthetics you would want ideally for something like this. Like,
I mean, look,
yeah, I've
look.
heard.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I heard someone talking about global abundance recently, but that doesn't
Oh,
quite do it for
Ezra
me.
Kleiny. Well,
The global is recline.
um, so I guess
You don't think
I
zigzagging towards justice is a good
I like I
slogan?
actually I don't know if I don't know if it's like what we want to call the new order, but I like that, right? And I do, I mean, I think your piece read more cynical than I think you are, right? Because
That's good to hear.
ultimately, like, I'm really, I am really against an analytical framework that disempowers us from thinking that there could be improvements in the world. I don't think that's true, right? I mean, you know, the post-war Europe that my parents were born into, on the ashes of the Holocaust and the deaths of, I don't know, 60 or 80 million people and the destruction of like an entire industrial base, right? I mean, just that kind of world changed into one that's a pretty good one to live in. And yes, it was done in rapacious, extractive ways that hurt the global South and so on. But there are systems, global systems that are more just and more fair and better for people, and there are global systems that are
Yes.
worse. And right now,
Yes.
we're moving in a direction that's worse. Um,
Yes.
and I do think that the basis of these things is values, right? It's like justice, values, universalism, these sorts of ideas that were the core of that stupidly named international liberal order. Nonetheless, it's a like, is it faith based? Okay, like fine, let's say it's faith based. I'd rather live in a world that's run by people who, just for reasons of faith alone, want to pretend that the world could become a better
Yes.
place than the opposite. Because I think the opposite is what we're seeing right now.
And maybe that's the advantage of thinking about this as something, going from thinking about this as something that existed and was destroyed to thinking about this as something that was always aspirational. Like at the end of the day, I don't see any alternative for the aspiration. Like whatever state we're in, whatever degree of disorder we face, the idea of building a world that is more peaceful, that is more stable, that is more has some kind of liberal rules governing it. I mean that still strikes me as the only way forward, and if nothing else, it's what we continue to fight for.
Yeah, and I mean the opposite of the liberal order was also a rules based order that was like the rules of sovereignty and great power competition, right? So in the days of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, when China would get upset if people criticized its policy in Tibet, and Russia would get mad if anyone said anything about the carpet bombing of Chechnya. The idea was like, we're all sovereigns, and we
Right.
don't tell you anything about what you do in your house. You don't tell us what we do in our house, and that's the rules. So they would say they also had a rules based order. It was illiberal. It was a rules based
Right.
illiberal order. And that's why I'd love us to get away from those terms and think about like just government, rights, representation, democracy. I kind of like democracy as a frame.
Well said.
So you're on board, Nick?
Look, I had said continue fighting for all these values. I don't see what the alternative is.
So when you come up with the name, with the new name, we'll come back on the podcast. Um,
Check back with me.
yeah, and if things keep going the way they are, we might have to change the name of the podcast to Ashes from
Just
Order,
ashes.
just
Just
Ashes.
ashes.
All right. Well, Nick Danforth, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you again.
You've been listening to Order from Ashes, the podcast of Century International. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. We'll see you again here next week.